It's 11:47 on a Sunday night. You need cash. You walk up to a wall, tap a piece of plastic against it, and 10 seconds later, you're holding money that belongs to you. Money nobody had to approve. Nobody had to hand you. Nobody even had to be awake for. You don't think about it. Why would you? It's the least interesting thing that happens to you all week. But here's the thing. That machine on the wall, the one you've never once thought twice about, didn't exist for almost all of American history. Not during the Civil War. Not during either World War. Not when a man walked on the moon. For nearly 200 years, the only way to get your own money out of your own bank account was to ask a person, during business hours, on a weekday, before 3 in the afternoon. So what did you actually do if you needed $20 on a Saturday night? What happened if your paycheck landed on a bank holiday? What did an entire family do when the cash in the cookie jar ran out on a Sunday, with the nearest bank locked, dark, and 2 days away from opening again? This is a story about the year that changed, about a man who spent his career building machines for airport luggage, and reinvented money while he was standing in line waiting for a teller. About an advertisement that promised a bank would open at 9 and never close again. About a machine so primitive it could hand you cash, but couldn't tell you how much you actually had. About bankers who were sure the whole idea would flop. About a hidden economy of tavern owners and corner stores that had been quietly cashing checks for decades, because the banks simply weren't there when people needed them. And about the bank that started all of it, a name that, if you look for it today, doesn't exist anymore. Because this isn't really a story about a machine. It's about the exact moment money stopped requiring a human being's permission. The same tug-of-war between convenience and control that's still playing out, right now, every time you tap your phone instead of your card. Let's go back before all of this, before the machine, before the card, before any of it. Picture America in the mid-1960s, and picture a bank. It's a solid building, usually on Main Street, usually with columns out front, like it's trying to convince you it's as permanent as a courthouse. And, in a way, it was. Because a bank in 1965 didn't run on machines. It ran on people, tellers behind brass grills, ledgers written in pen, a manager who probably knew your name and, more importantly, knew whether you were good for it. Here's the part that's easy to forget. That bank was only open when the people inside it were willing to be there. 10 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. Monday through Friday. That was it. No evenings. No weekends. No holidays. If you had a job, and most people did, those hours weren't just inconvenient. They were often physically impossible to make it to. You'd have needed to leave work in the middle of the day, drive across town, stand in line, and get back before anyone noticed you were gone. For a lot of working Americans, that math simply didn't work. So, what happened when you needed cash outside that narrow little window? You improvised, and an entire shadow economy quietly built itself around the gaps banks left behind. Corner stores cashed paychecks. For a fee, of course. Tavern owners did the same thing, especially on Fridays, when a line of factory workers would come straight from their shift with a check in hand and nowhere else to turn it into money before the weekend. Some of those bar owners kept more cash on hand on a Friday night than the till technically needed, because cashing checks was its own quiet side business, and a loyal one at that. Families kept reserves at home, in drawers, in coffee cans, in the classic under-the-mattress cliché that existed for a very unglamorous reason. Sometimes, that was genuinely the only money you had access to until Monday. And if none of that worked, You relied on relationships. You knew your teller. Your teller knew you. Maybe your branch manager would let you write a check against next week's paycheck because he trusted you, or because your father banked there for 30 years, or because that's simply how small-town credit worked before anyone had a credit score. Getting money wasn't a transaction. It was a favor, extended by a person who had the power to say no. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it means access to your own money wasn't really a right. It was permission. Permission granted by business hours, by a teller's judgment, by whether the guy behind the counter liked you. Naturally, this system had a breaking point. As the American economy moved faster, more people working shifts, more households with two incomes, more everyday life happening outside that narrow 9 to 3 window. The gap between when people needed money and when banks were willing to hand it to them kept getting wider. And banks knew it. They just didn't have a fix yet. The fix, when it came, wasn't going to come from a banker at all. It came from a country 3,000 years, 3,000 miles, away, and then from a man who had spent his career building machines that had absolutely nothing to do with money. He built machines that sorted suitcases. And somewhere between an airport conveyor belt and a very long line at his own bank, he was about to have an idea that would end 400 years of banker's hours for good. 2 years before Don Wetzel ever thought about baggage or bank lines, the first crack in the wall had already opened up, not in America, but in a quiet corner of North London. His name was John Shepherd Barron, and by most accounts, he wasn't thinking about banking at all when the idea hit him. He was thinking about chocolate. Specifically, he was thinking about vending machines, the kind that took your coin and gave you a candy bar in return, no cashier required. It's such a simple mechanism that we barely register it as technology anymore. Drop something in, get something back. No conversation, no judgment, no waiting for a person to decide you're worth serving. And somewhere in that thought, Shepherd Barron landed on the obvious, almost embarrassingly obvious question. If a machine could hand out chocolate without a person standing there, why couldn't a machine hand out cash? It sounds so simple now that it's hard to appreciate how strange it must have felt in 1967. Money wasn't candy. Money was serious. Money was the one thing everyone assumed absolutely required a human being to verify, to count, to approve. The idea that you could just build a box that gave it out, the same way it gave out a Twix, that was close to heretical for a banking industry built entirely on trust, ledgers, and a teller's signature. But Shepherd Barron pitched it anyway, and on June 27, 1967, his machine went live at a Barclays branch in Enfield, a suburb in North London. It's genuinely considered the world's first ATM. Full stop, not just the first in Britain. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the sleek backlit machine you're used to. It was a box in a wall. But it worked, and it worked on the same basic logic Shepherd Barron had started with at the vending machine. You didn't need to build a smarter banker. You needed to remove the banker from the equation entirely. Here's the part that matters for where this story goes next. Britain didn't just beat America to the idea by accident. They beat America to the problem. British banks were dealing with the exact same rigid hours, the exact same gap between when people needed money and when a human being was willing to hand it over. Shepherd Barron wasn't solving some uniquely British issue. He was solving the same issue every industrialized country with bankers' hours was quietly struggling with. He just got there first. And once it worked in Enfield, it was only a matter of time before someone on the other side of the Atlantic looked at that same gap. The same 9 to 3, same closed weekends, same locked doors on a Friday night, and asked the exact same question. That someone wasn't a banker. It wasn't even someone who worked in finance. He was an executive at a company that, up until that point, had built its entire business around solving a completely different kind of gap, the one between a passenger getting off a plane and their suitcase actually showing up. His name was Don Wetzel, and according to the story he told for the rest of his life, the idea for the American version of this machine didn't come to him in a boardroom or a lab or a meeting about banking technology at all. It came to him standing in a line, waiting, like everyone else in America, for a teller to have a minute for him. Don Wetzel didn't work in banking. He worked for a company called Docutel, based out of Dallas, and Docutel's entire business, at that point, had nothing to do with money at all. They built automated baggage handling equipment, machines that sorted suitcases at airports, moving them from a plane to a carousel without a human having to haul each one by hand. Docutel was, in other words, in the business of removing people from repetitive physical tasks, just not people's money, yet. Wetzel wasn't an engineer either. He was a department head, someone who understood how to get an idea from a sketch to a working machine, not someone who built the machine himself. And the way he told it, for the rest of his life, the idea for an American cash machine didn't come out of some strategy meeting. It came out of boredom. He was standing in a line at his own bank, waiting for a teller, watching the same thing happen over and over, person after person, waiting for a human being to become available to hand them their own money. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's almost the exact same spark that hit Shepard Barron 2 years earlier and 3,000 miles away. A smart, mildly impatient man standing in a line, looking at an inefficient system and thinking, this doesn't need a person. It needs a machine. Wetzel brought the idea back to Docutel, and on paper it made a strange kind of sense. The company was already in the business of building machines that moved things reliably, without supervision, in high-traffic public places. A suitcase on a conveyor belt and a stack of cash in a locked drawer weren't as different as they sounded. But here's where the story gets less triumphant. Bankers were not exactly lining up to hand a Dallas baggage company the keys to their vaults. The resistance was real, and it was specific. Cost was one problem. Early estimates put the price of running one of these machines at roughly $8,000 a year more than simply paying a human teller to do the job. That's not a small number to a bank trying to justify a brand-new, unproven piece of hardware. And the other problem was harder to put a price on: trust. Bankers weren't convinced their customers wanted a machine handling their money. This was an era where banking was built on relationships, on a teller who knew your face, a manager who knew your history. Handing that off to a metal box felt, to a lot of people in the industry, like a genuine risk to the entire premise of what a bank was supposed to be. So the idea sat there, half-doubted, for a while. Skepticism from the very people who'd have to install it. No guarantee it would work. No guarantee anyone would trust it, even if it did. And then, despite all of that hesitation, somebody said yes anyway. On September 2nd, 1969, at a chemical bank branch on Long Island, they turned the machine on and found out, all at once, whether America was ready for a bank that never closed. The branch was in Rockville Center, a small town on Long Island. Nothing especially remarkable about it, which was sort of the point. Chemical Bank wasn't testing this thing in some flagship Manhattan location surrounded by cameras and executives. They put it on the wall of an ordinary neighborhood branch on North Village Avenue and let ordinary people decide whether it worked. The machine itself had a name that sounds almost sweetly clunky today: the Docuteller. Half document, half teller. A machine doing a teller's job by reading a document of sorts. The same magnetic striped card Docutel had built for it. And that detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because this wasn't just the first ATM in America. It was the first time anyone in the country had used a magnetically encoded, reusable plastic card to pull cash out of a wall. The technology underneath your debit card today, the strip you still occasionally have to swipe when the chip reader's acting up, effectively starts right here in Rockville Center in 1969. Chemical Bank didn't undersell it either. Their ad campaign made a promise that, at the time, must have sounded almost like science fiction. On September 2nd, our bank will open at 9 o'clock and never close again. Read that again. Not open longer hours. Not open on Saturdays. Never close again. After roughly 400 years of banking running on a human being's schedule, a bank in a small town on Long Island was telling its customers the doors were, functionally, never going to lock. And people showed up to test that promise. Curious customers walked up to a machine bolted into a bank wall, fed it a card they'd never used before, and watched it do something no machine in America had done: hand them their own cash, on command, with no teller, no ledger, no human decision involved at all. For a moment, it must have felt like the future had arrived early. But, and this is the part that gets left out of the celebratory version of this story, the Docuteller was, by any modern standard, remarkably dumb. It could do exactly one thing: dispense a fixed amount of cash to anyone who inserted a valid card. That's it. It had no way to check how much money was actually in your account. It couldn't tell you your balance. It couldn't tell the bank your balance, in real time, either. As far as the machine was concerned, if you had a valid card, you got cash, whether or not there was enough in your account to cover it. Sit with that for a second, because it's a strange kind of promise. "Our bank will never close again" is a wonderful marketing line. It's a much less comforting sentence when the machine making good on that promise literally cannot verify whether it's giving away money that doesn't exist. That gap between the confidence of the advertisement and the actual capability of the hardware wasn't just a footnote. It was about to become Chemical Bank's real problem. Because a machine that hands out cash on trust alone works exactly as well as the honesty of the people using it. And not everyone, it turned out, was going to be honest. The Docuteller had solved the access problem beautifully. Anyone with a card could get money any hour of the day, 7 days a week. The exact gap that had defined banking for centuries, closed almost overnight. What it hadn't solved, what nobody at Docutel or Chemical Bank had fully worked out yet, was how you build a machine you can trust with money when the machine itself can't count. That was the next problem. And it was about to make a lot of bankers feel like their skepticism had been justified all along. Here's what it actually looked like, day to day, for the staff at that Rockville Center branch. A customer would come in, get issued a card, and the tellers had almost no way of knowing, at the moment they handed it over, whether that person actually had enough money sitting in their account to justify it. There was no live connection between the machine and your balance. No instant check. No red flag. Just a card and a machine that trusted the card completely. That put bank employees in a genuinely uncomfortable position. Should they issue a card to someone whose account ran a little thin some months? What happened if a customer's balance dropped after they'd already been given a card? Did the machine know? It didn't. Not really. Which meant the entire system was, in a very real sense, running on the honor system, dressed up in the shape of modern technology. Some accounts from the time suggest Chemical Bank tried to patch this with a blunt fix, capping how much a customer could pull out in a single day, somewhere in the neighborhood of $150, as a kind of safety net against the machine's blind spot. That specific number is worth taking with a grain of salt. It shows up in some retellings and not in others, but the instinct behind it is completely believable. If the machine can't verify your balance, at least limit how much damage an empty account can do in 24 hours. And the balance problem wasn't the only headache. Chemical Bank and Docutel had to solve a string of unglamorous, unsexy technical problems just to get this far. Finding a manufacturer who could reliably put a magnetic stripe on the back of a plastic card at scale. Figuring out how to print a paper receipt inside a machine that lived on the outside of a building. Weatherproofing hardware that had never before had to survive a Long Island winter. None of that shows up in the "Our bank will never close again" ad copy. All of it was happening behind the scenes, mostly invisible to the customers who just wanted their $20. Then there was the resistance that never really went away, the same one Wetzel had run into back at Docutel's Dallas headquarters. Bankers outside Rockville Center were watching this experiment from a distance, and a lot of them were still not convinced. The cost math hadn't improved. The trust question hadn't gone away. If anything, a machine that couldn't check a customer's balance was exactly the kind of story a skeptical banker would point to as proof they'd been right to hesitate. See, you can imagine them saying, "You can't hand money over to a box." A person would have caught that. So Chemical Bank found itself in an odd spot. First to market, genuinely revolutionary, and still not fully sure the thing they'd built could be trusted at scale. They'd solved the access half of the problem beautifully. Nights, weekends, holidays, none of that mattered anymore to anyone holding a Docuteller card. But the accuracy half of the problem, the part where a machine actually understands what's happening in your account in real time, was still years away. For the idea to survive, for this to become more than one bank's interesting experiment in one small town, the machine needed to get smarter. It needed to actually understand your account, not just trust your card. That upgrade came 2 years later. And it didn't just fix the Docuteller's blind spot. It kicked off a race between two companies that would define what an ATM even was for the next decade. By 1971, Docutel had fixed the blind spot. Their new machine was called the Total Teller, and the name wasn't just marketing, it was the point. Unlike the original Docuteller, which could only spit out a fixed amount of cash on faith, the Total Teller could actually check a balance. It could handle more than one kind of transaction. For the first time, the machine wasn't just dispensing money. It was starting to understand your account the way a human teller did. That single upgrade changed everything about how seriously banks were willing to take this technology. The Docuteller had been a curiosity, a neat trick at one branch on Long Island. The Total Teller was something banks could actually build a business case around, because it closed the exact gap that had made cautious bankers so nervous 2 years earlier. And once that trust problem eased up, the growth curve got steep, fast. By 1973, just 2 years later, there were roughly 2,000 ATMs operating across the United States, the overwhelming majority of them Docutel machines. 2,000 might not sound like a lot by today's standards, when there are over 1 million ATMs worldwide, and a new one goes up somewhere roughly every 5 minutes. But go from one machine in one town to 2,000 machines nationwide in 4 years. That's not gradual adoption. That's a company barely able to keep up with demand. Each of those machines cost around $30,000. For context, that's not far off from the price of a house in some parts of the country at the time. Banks weren't dabbling in this technology anymore. They were making a serious financial bet that customers actually wanted their money without a human being attached to it. And where there's a fast-growing, expensive new market, competitors show up. Docutel didn't get to keep this to itself for long. A company called Diebold, which had spent decades building bank vaults and safes, about as old school and trusted a name in banking hardware as existed, started developing its own line of machines around the same time. Their first, the Tabs 500, went into a bank in Atlanta in 1974. They followed it with the Tabs 550, and eventually the Tabs 600, refining the hardware with each version. This is worth pausing on, because it says something about how fast the ATM had gone from risky experiment to essential banking infrastructure. Diebold wasn't a scrappy startup chasing a trend. They were a century-old conservative company that made its money on physical security. When a company like that decides it needs to be in the ATM business, that's not speculation anymore. That's an industry deciding this technology isn't going away. The race kept accelerating through the rest of the decade. By 1978, Diebold had a machine running on IBM-compatible systems installed in Indianapolis, tying the ATM into the broader computing infrastructure that was starting to reshape every other industry at the same time. And by 1980, the machine had left the wall entirely. The first drive-up ATM went in at a bank in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, letting customers get cash without even stepping out of their car. The device that started as a single experimental box on Long Island had, in 11 years, become something you could interact with from the driver's seat. Somewhere in the middle of all that growth, though, something quieter happened. Something almost nobody noticed at the time, because it wasn't dramatic. It didn't make headlines the way a drive-up ATM did. It was just a name, slowly disappearing from signage, from ads, from the public conversation, the way company names tend to when they get absorbed into something bigger. Chemical Bank, the bank that had taken the actual risk back in 1969 when nobody knew if any of this would work, was still out there. Still Chemical Bank. For now. That wasn't going to last. In 1995, a quarter-century after that first machine went live in Rockville Centre, the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History made it official. Docutel and Don Wetzel were formally recognized as the inventors of the networked ATM. It's a fitting honor, and a slightly odd one, because, by that point, Docutel, the scrappy Dallas baggage company that had stumbled into reinventing money, was already a footnote in an industry it had helped create. The Diebold's and the IBM-compatible systems and everyone who came after had, in a lot of ways, eclipsed the company that built the very first machine. And then, in 1996, the other name in this story disappeared too. Chemical Bank. The bank that took the actual risk back in 1969, the one that put an unproven machine on the outside wall of an ordinary branch and let ordinary customers decide whether to trust it, was acquired by Chase. The name didn't survive the merger. Walk past that same building on North Village Avenue in Rockville Centre today, and it's a Chase branch. Nothing on the sign tells you that this specific spot is where American banking stopped requiring a human being's permission. There's something almost poetic about that, and not in a comforting way. The company that took the biggest risk in this entire story, the one that bet on a machine nobody was sure customers would trust, doesn't even get its name on the building anymore. It got absorbed, the way a lot of first movers do, by the very industry it helped transform. But the machine itself didn't disappear. It did the opposite. It went everywhere. Today, there are well over 1 million ATMs on the planet, and by some estimates, a new one is installed somewhere in the world roughly every 5 minutes. They're not just outside banks anymore, either. They've spread to gas stations, convenience stores, casinos, cruise ships, airports. There's reportedly even one at McMurdo Station, a U.S. research base in Antarctica, meaning you can, in theory, pull cash out of a wall on the one continent with no permanent human residence at all. Something that started as a single skeptical experiment on Long Island has become one of the most quietly ubiquitous machines in the world, sitting in more places than most people ever stop to notice. And here's the thing worth sitting with. None of that happened because banks fell in love with the idea. It happened because customers did. Every single hesitation the bankers had back in 1969, the cost, the trust, the fear that people wouldn't want a machine handling their money, turned out to be wrong, or at least beside the point. People didn't just accept the ATM. They came to expect it. Within a decade of that first machine, the bank never closes stopped being an audacious ad slogan and started being the baseline assumption everyone walked around with. That's the part of this story that's easy to miss if you only focus on the technology. The real shift wasn't the magnetic stripe, or the total teller's ability to check a balance, or the drive-up window in Baton Rouge. The real shift was in what people started to believe they were owed. Once an entire generation grew up knowing their money was available at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, there was no going back to banker's hours. The machine didn't just meet a demand that already existed. It created a new baseline expectation that banking itself, quietly, had to live up to from then on. Which brings us to the actual question this whole story has been circling from the very first minute. So here's the real question underneath all of this. Not, when did the ATM get invented? That's just a date, September 2nd, 1969, easy enough to look up. The real question is, who used to decide whether you could have your own money? For nearly all of American history, the answer was a person. A teller who knew your face, a branch manager who knew your family, or didn't. A set of hours, 10 to 3, Monday through Friday, that had nothing to do with when you actually needed cash and everything to do with when a human being was willing to be there to hand it to you. Getting your own money out of your own account wasn't really a right. It was a favor, granted on a schedule that suited the bank, not you. The ATM didn't just add convenience to that system. It quietly removed the person from the middle of it. And once that happened, once a machine could hand you cash without asking a human being's permission first, something shifted that never really shifted back. The bar for what access to your own money meant got permanently higher. Nobody was ever going to accept bankers' hours again, not once they'd had a taste of a bank that genuinely never closed. And that same tug of war, convenience against control, a machine against a gatekeeper, hasn't gone anywhere. It just moved. Cash withdrawals from ATMs have actually been declining for years now, as more of daily spending moves to cards and phones. The Docuteller's great-grandchild isn't a machine in a wall anymore. It's the tap of a phone at a checkout counter, an app that moves money between accounts in seconds, a system that increasingly doesn't involve a human, a card, or even a physical machine at all. Every time that happens, it's the same basic bet Chemical Bank made back in 1969. Trust the machine, remove the person, and hope customers go along with it. They did then. They still do now. That's really the through line here. Not the technology itself, which keeps changing every decade, but the appetite behind it. Once people get a taste of not needing anyone's permission to access what's already theirs, they don't go back. Every generation since 1969 has just been negotiating the next version of that same deal. So next time you tap a card against a machine at midnight and walk away with cash in 10 seconds, it's worth remembering what that moment actually replaced. A teller, a set of hours, and a system where your own money wasn't fully yours until someone decided to let you have it.